Hey YouTube. Let's talk a little bit about hyperoxygenation prior to lifting. It's not a concept that is often discussed that I see a lot of. And a lot of the times, if it is discussed, it's very much discussed in a simple manner to like take deep breaths prior to lifting. So what I want to do with making this video is explain why we hyperoxygenate prior to a lift, what the fuck hyperoxygenation is, and simple supply and demand for the body. So bear with me for just a little bit while I explain supply and demand, all right? And then everything all of a sudden makes sense. So with your body, we have what's called oxygen supply and demand. When oxygen supply exceeds oxygen demand in the body, everything runs perfectly, right? Your brain doesn't have to make any decisions on where the oxygen goes. It goes everywhere. Everything works in unison. However, having said that, when oxygen demand exceeds supply, your brain has to start making decisions. What do I got to cut off in order to keep the rest of the body going, right? It's almost like your brain is doing triage, all right? So it's like, all right, the two things that absolutely must run in the body are the brain and the heart. Do you know why? Because a little fact for you, the only two organs in the body that aren't able to store their own oxygen is the brain and the heart. Why? Heart never stops beating long enough to be able to store oxygen. It just can't. And the brain doesn't have the capacity. It also doesn't have the capacity to store glucose. Also, you know, that's why you might have heard like the brain runs on sugar and oxygen or glucose and oxygen, right? You need it. You need it in your body because it can't store it for you. I'm babbling now, so let's get back on track. So, oxygen supply versus demand. If demand exceeds supply, your brain makes an instant triage. Okay, crap. Heart's got to run, brain's got to run. I want my organs to run, I want my kidneys functioning, I want my liver functioning. I don't really give a shit that you want to flex your bicep or you want to flex your quads. So the first thing that goes is your extremities, arms, legs. Why? Because you can live without a fucking arm. You can. You can't live without your kidneys and you can't live without your heart. So that's what your body's going to do, right? It's going to start shutting down systems outside of your core to best supply oxygen to what is actually necessary for life. So what it comes down to is your body does not give a shit that you want to make gains. All it wants to do is keep going, right? And that's why our bodies are smarter than us, because otherwise people would literally shut down their hearts to do bicep curls. That's how dumb we are as a species, or at least how dumb we've evolved as a species, in my opinion. Now, given what we know now about oxygen supply and demand, and we know that we need to have more oxygen than is required, otherwise our body starts triaging itself and shutting down parts of the body that don't need to function, essentially, for living. So let's say you want to go do a heavy back squat, right? And, you know, a little bit about human evolution. Our lungs actually store vastly more oxygen than is required to live. When you breathe in, when you breathe out, when your heart beats, you actually have way more oxygen than you need for everything to function. Why? It's evolution, you know, and if you don't believe in evolution, then fucking magical pixie dust and stuff like that. But let's go back to evolution for a second. So your body has evolved in order to understand that you might not always have high oxygen. Let's say you're in a low oxygen environment. You're at a high altitude. Well, if your lungs can only store enough oxygen for a normal altitude and then you go to a lower oxygen environment, you're going to fucking die, right? So our bodies have evolved to make our lung capacity larger than required. That's just to fucking survive, though. That's just to move around, doing what I'm doing. I'm dancing in place, doing a little dance for you guys. My body has enough oxygen to do that. Yes, I've been drinking. Fuck you. So, having said that, let's talk a little bit about oxygen supply and demand when it comes to lifting. When you go to do that heavy back squat, if you haven't hyperoxygenated your system and it's only storing enough oxygen for basic necessities, when you go to do that heavy lift, if halfway through the lift, a quarter through the lift, whatever, even 3/4 through the lift, your body gets to the point where the circulating oxygen in your blood is too low to maintain complete function, your brain will instantly kick in within milliseconds and start triaging. And it's saying, okay, those gigantic quads and hamstrings that you got that are using a crap ton of oxygen right now to do this lift are taking the oxygen I need to keep your heart beating. So what does it do? It shuts your fucking legs down. Right? Like that's how you'll be moving up and then all of a sudden you're like, why am I going down all of a sudden? I want to go up. Because your body's shutting itself down, right? Your body, I mean, obviously it's not like you're going to die, but it shuts itself down, right? It has to, right? It has to triage that oxygen to the most important parts of your body, which aren't your quads and your hamstrings. So what we can do to combat this, or combat our body from having to pull oxygen and blood from extremities during a lift, is we hyperoxygenate. How we do this? 3-4 really deep breaths, either prior to unracking the bar. Ooh, excuse me, belch. Prior to unracking the bar, or simply after you unrack the bar. What I commonly do is I will take 3-4 deep breaths in, for like back squat for example, unrack the bar, take a couple steps back, because I know I've now used oxygen just to move my body back, take 2 or 3 deep breaths in, hold it, and then do my lift. Why is this important, or how does this help us? A deep breath, now when I say taking deep breaths in, I don't mean hyperventilation. None of this stuff, because you're not expanding the lungs significantly enough to get air to all the alveoli and to get blood circulating optimally, right? We're talking deep breaths. Stuff like that, where you're expanding your chest and you're really using your lung capacity. And what this is going to do is it's going to get as much oxygen as possible in your circulating hemoglobin so that when your muscles need that oxygen to operate, it's available. So take some deep breaths in, deep breaths out prior to a lift. And what this is going to do is it's just going to make sure lots of oxygen is running around your body so that when you go to lift, your body doesn't have to do that oxygen supply versus demand, right? You always want to make sure that your oxygen supply is higher than your demand. Right? Now I know we're not talking about glucose here, and we're not talking about how many carbs or your energy level or anything. I'm just talking oxygen, something we can very simply control. All right, especially if you're cutting or you're on a low carb diet and whatnot. Right? It all comes down to oxygenation. Now, how we know that the hyperoxygenation works is when. Actually, I'm going to draw from my nursing practice right now. When we go to intubate somebody, which is where we stick a tube down into your lungs and we breathe for you, right? Cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, stuff like this. If we have the capacity to get somebody to take a couple deep breaths in before we sedate them in order to intubate, or they're already in respiratory distress, we'll give them several lungs full of high oxygen so that the blood that is circulating is as oxygenated as possible, and then we'll go to intubate. Intubation takes a while. It can take 1 minute, it can take 2 minutes, sometimes it can take 3 minutes, right? So we need to make sure that the supply of oxygen in the body is enough that it doesn't have to start shutting down your internal organs, your heart doesn't start going into failure, right? And that's just a person lying there. They're not moving. Probably we've sedated them and paralyzed them because we're going to intubate and we need their lungs to not move and we need them to not move. But research has shown us that if we hyperoxygenate the blood prior to intubation, you can spend 2 or 3 minutes intubating somebody, and there's going to be no damage to the brain, no damage to the heart, no damage to the organs. Why? Because the oxygen supply in the blood system exceeds the demand of a sedated body that's just lying there. Right? Not a lot of oxygen being used there. But when we go ahead and lift, we are using a ton of oxygen. Not only are we now asking our body to keep all of our organs running, we're asking our body to also keep our body lifting efficiently. So, 8 minutes. I always look at the top and I'm like, God, I've been talking forever on a topic that probably I could have said 30 seconds of. So, deep breaths in, deep breaths out prior to lifting, all right, because we're trying to combat that oxygen supply versus demand. We're trying to make sure that the lifting that we're doing isn't being shut down or cut short due to oxygen supply. If you got no energy and you got no glucose to run, different topic entirely. But if you're not breathing properly prior to a lift, you might be sabotaging your gains because your body doesn't give a shit that you want nice biceps, nice quads, that you want a 500-pound back squat. All it cares about is that your heart keeps beating, your brain's functioning, and at the end of your lifting, you're not in complete distress and dying. So I hope you guys understand now why we hyperoxygenate prior to a lift. Like we take those deep breaths in, deep breaths out to maximize the oxygen in our system to our muscles so that our body doesn't have to shut shit down. There are times when I talk during my videos that I'm sure I sound like maybe a little bit intelligent, and then there are times where I sound like the dumbest human being on earth because I swear too much. It's a dichotomy. Anyways, so that's it, guys. I hope this makes sense on how and why we want to hyperoxygenate our blood prior to a big lift or any lifting at all. If you're going for reps, though, hyperoxygenation still works because you're going to hyperoxygenate, you're going to go do a rep, stand up, maybe take a breath in, and then you go and you do another rep. There's still going to be a ton of oxygen running around your system after you do your first rep. So you don't have to hyperoxygenate between every rep. You want to do it prior to the lifting. And yeah, that's about it, guys. Questions and comments down below. I hope all this made sense and it wasn't just me rambling at a camera for 10 minutes. And as always, guys, remember, eat like a bodybuilder and train like a powerlifter.